So I'm going to go ahead and get started. There might be more people joining later on, but it's nice to meet all of you. I'm Sarah. I'm one of the reference librarians here at Lincoln Library. And so this is our third Science Cafe program. So thank you to all of you for coming. I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker for tonight. So our speaker is Dr. Ed DeWalt. He's an aquatic entomologist that works at the University of Illinois and the Illinois Natural History Survey, and he's been there since 1996. He received his PhD in 1992 from the University of North Texas in Denton. He specializes in the study of stoneflies, which are insects in the order Mekopteron. And he works on a large range of topics such as descriptions of new species, relatedness of stonefly higher categories such as families, subfamilies, and genera, changes of the fauna through time, and conservation of stoneflies. And currently he has projects ongoing in the Midwest, Northeast, and the Gulf South. And so with that out of the way, I'll go ahead and let Dr. DeWalt start his presentation.
Okay, there it is. Can everybody see the presentation? Wave your hand. Or
I can see it okay.
Okay, good. All right, I was asked to speak about winter active insects. So I'm going to throw in something about some of their distant relatives too, because I do encounter them when I'm out doing field work. My email's there, dewalt@illinois.edu, if you have any questions afterward. And I think probably Sarah has maybe provided you with that email as well. If not, throw up the chat and I'll make sure it gets in there. So, you all know most invertebrates, insects included, are summer active, and that there are very few that are winter active that you can be out and see. Those that are active in the winter for insects have some commonalities. Often they're either wingless or precipitous, meaning they have very short wings, or inverts in general that are active this time of year are usually pretty dark bodied, and that's so they can absorb sunlight during the day. It's important that you understand that most of the winter active insects are actually native ones. Some of them may be beneficial. All of them are going to be pretty sensitive to environmental changes, and they could be lost with climate change. You'll see from some of the examples that I give you that they're rather sensitive, or in areas that won't fare well with big changes in temperature. So there are some advantages to being winter active. Biggest of which is that there's pretty low predation. There are some birds that would eat insects that are winter active, or some of the other invertebrates that are winter active, but by and large, the big flush of birds is not going to be in the cold situations. There's also lower competition. Lots of insects, of course, go dormant at this time of year, and so competition for food and space is less. There are some distinct disadvantages, though. There's a lot of risk to freezing, and there are some behavioral and physiological mechanisms that help them overcome that risk. So I'm going to show you some pictures of some different types of winter active invertebrates. Some of them will be insects, some of them are other groups of organisms. So the large image there is of a type of winter crane fly. it's actually a true fly, but it doesn't have any wings. Although you can see a couple little lollipops sticking up from its back. True flies have one pair of flight wings, unless they're after us altogether. And they have this second pair of vestigial wings that they're called halteres, and they're usually used to help the insect figure out its body position when it's flying. Of course, this one doesn't fly at all. I don't think this particular genus is around here. I think it's a Western one. But there's another family of crane flies, this one here with the wings, and you've probably seen it even if you didn't know what it was. If you go out in your patio, let's say in November, December, January, on days that are just above freezing, you may see a flight of insects moving up and down. These are males of this species, and it's a flight to attract females. So there may be a dozen of them in the flight, and so if you just look around in the winter time and it's above freezing, you may see these, even if it's been fairly cold recently. This thing is not very big. It looks monstrous and menacing, but it's a winter scorpion fly, and it may only be 5 or 6, 7 millimeters long, crawling across the snow. It's after us. Its body is dark, and it's usually a fairly northern thing or high altitude thing. I have only seen 1 or 2 of them. You find them crawling across the snow. A Mekopteron is a scorpion fly, and there are lots of them in the winter or in the summertime. Males have this recurved abdominal tip with a little bulb and what looks like a pincer that can grab onto things, and they sort of throw it at others around them if they're being threatened. But this one doesn't have that ability. There are also, living on glaciers, these columbella. A common name for columbella in general is springtails. And so these things could be found on a glacier, or there are other springtails. When I was ice fishing as a kid, I could see thousands of them jumping up and down in my ice hole. Or you go to any stream side in the winter right now, and you pick up leaves that are at the edge of the stream, and there'll be columbella all over them. But these are particularly called snow fleas because they live on glaciers, and you might actually see large aggregations of them. There are some other things that are on glaciers. There's kind of a famous little ice worm that on glaciers in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska and British Columbia, there may be so many of them to make the glacier look dark. My guess is that they might not have more than a couple centuries to do that. They may be gone before too long, because many of the glaciers are melting rapidly. But it's like a little earthworm, and it gleans little bits of algae and bacteria from the surface of the glacier. You can see in this picture that there are many of them in this shaded area. Out in the open sunshine, I suspect that the sunlight's too intense for them. They're often said to be not out in bright areas, but once the sun comes over the vanishes from the glacier, then the worms come out. They actually live deep in the ice and snow on top of the glacier. Now, you have heard that I study stoneflies, and it's sort of a passion of mine. And so my students have studied a lot of aspects of winter stoneflies. In fact, in this state, there are 80 stonefly species known. 27 of those are actually winter species. So there are actually quite a lot of them. And, you know, they're kind of like ants during the winter time. If you went out to a stream side, you know, a place that I remember that's like that, that has so many of them, would be Turkey Run State Park. There's a Sugar Creek there. And if you walk along Sugar Creek, they'll look like ants crawling through the on top of the snow or through the leaves. They're that abundant. So this picture here actually shows a male that's sort of guarding a female. The female has the long wings, the male has the short wings. So this thing is either was just in the process of mating or will be soon. My students, student here, Massimo, from several years ago, actually is on an ice floe on the edge of the Namakegan River in Wisconsin, collecting winter stoneflies there. And there might be eight or so different species on that ice floe. Now, sometimes it's just a little bit on the dangerous side to get these things. And large rivers in cold climes often build up ice on top of them. And the ice has to break up as the waters come in from smaller streams and raise the level of the water in the river. Sometimes that produces an ice dam. So maybe a big wall of ice that's stuck in the middle of the river. And I just about, well, I might not be here if I was not paying attention. This is the Black River in southwestern Wisconsin. And when we were there, it looked like this in the upper right, water rolling over a riffle. Unbeknownst to us upstream, there was a big ice dam. We were working underneath the bridge. We had a bag down there with our water chemistry meter, and we're collecting stuff off the bridge abutment. And all of a sudden, we started hearing things slamming on the bridge abutments, making an awful lot of noise. We noticed that our bag with the water chemistry meter was starting to float downstream, so we grabbed that and ran up to the top of the bridge. This picture was taken before any of this took place. And so, actually nice looking stream. In a few moments later, and I apologize for the shortness of the video, but I was a little upset when this took place. You could see that the ice was flowing past the bridge rapidly, and I think I lost my balance at the time because it was slamming against the bridge. But we got great stuff from there. We just got it before everything went to heck. Sorry. Well, actually, these things on the left here, this is a special stonefly. The male has really short, crinkly wings, and then long, crinkly wings. It can't fly worth a flip. The females have long wings so that they can fly if the temperature gets up to like 40 or so degrees Fahrenheit. Different genus altogether. This stonefly was on a bridge, minding its own business at another location. but they're all winter emerging stoneflies. So they could have temperatures into the low 40s, and they're out moving around eating lichens and algae off of trees or off of the bridges. And maybe within an hour later, a front has blown through and it's gone down to 10 degrees or so. So they could get caught out pretty easily. There's another one. A colleague of mine sent me some pictures of a while back. He described a new species of stonefly that actually lives in a glacier in Argentina. The lower right is what this thing lives in. Little rivulets of water, and then it crawls out on the snow looking for algae and bacteria to eat. This is the adult here. It's an Apterous thing. You see the body is black. There's a picture over here of a nymph it's an immature stage, and it has little rosette of gills here. And it's in water on a bit of ice, and this is a danger for them actually touching ice, but so long as the water around it is above freezing, then there is no problem for them. So there is this difficulty of how they avoid freezing. You can see this is a nymph of a species that is crawling out across the ice along the Wisconsin River. If it were to get very cold very quickly, and this thing is touching ice and the water on top freezes, then there's a possibility that everything freezes in the organism. But there are some behavioral thermoregulation that they can do. You can see their bodies are black, and they will crawl out of all kinds of crevices during the daylight, even when the temperature is not above freezing, and bask in the sunlight, and they can raise their body temperature considerably by doing that. When it's not sunny and it's not near freezing, they will drop down into places and hide. Sometimes I can dig them out from gravel and things that pile up alongside of a bridge abutment. And so that big concrete structure is absorbing heat from the sun, or is still holding it from the previous day. And they have a means of holding or hiding from these cold temperatures at night. I have made trips into Oklahoma and Texas looking for winter stonefly adults. And, you know, this was early February, and I expected Texas and Oklahoma to be actually in the 50s, and it had dropped down into the 20s, and I had to go to big trees alongside of the stream and rip bark off of them, like sycamore trees, and pull that stuff into it's called a beating sheet. So it's a sheet that has a couple pieces of wood that make the canvas nice and tight. So I ripped that stuff off into that canvas sheet, and I could pick up the specimens that I needed, doing some molecular work with them. But you travel that distance, and you don't have the best of weather, but you don't always have the ability to predict that stuff. So you have to try to get them even if the weather's crappy. But most important to these things is that they have some physiological means to try to protect themselves from freezing. Many insects and other invertebrates have the ability to produce some alcohols like glycerol and some sugars that It's kind of like, you know, you put salt in water and you can depress the boiling point. And so you add these chemicals, you have to expend energy to produce them, but they will help you to keep the fluid around the cells from freezing. So you're actually depressing the freezing point with these things that you produce. Other insects may then also produce antifreeze proteins. They're small proteins that act to provide a nucleus about which ice can form, but they keeps the ice crystals really small. So, I mean, you've seen ice crystals grow sometimes and they get really long and pointy. That happens inside of a cell. That cell is dead. So these antifreeze proteins are also mostly outside of the cell, trying to make sure that the ice crystals don't get too large and produce too much damage. And then some of these supercooling alcohols and sugars and antifreeze proteins will help to pull out water from cells, and that'll dehydrate the cells, so there's less chance for water to produce a crystal to freeze at that point. You folks have any questions? No, this is maybe moving along a little fast for you, but if you have questions, just
I have a question.
go ahead.
You're talking about lakes exclusively. Does that mean these insects are not around? I mean, you're talking about rivers. Does this mean they're not around lakes?
There are some that live in lakes, sure, especially in northern latitudes and high altitudes. Lakes in
But
low
not, for
altitude,
example, Lake Springfield?
well, they would have some columbella. There won't be much of anything else that's native that is winter active invertebrate from man-made lakes, lakes at low elevation, lakes that tend to get really warm in the wintertime. But if you went to Lake Superior, there'd be all kinds of these black-bodied things crawling out of that lake because it's deep and it's very cold, and there's lots of food, and yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know. This is pretty busy here, but when people talk about cold hardiness for insects and invertebrates, they sort of lump things into whether or not they have freeze tolerance. It means they have more proteins and more alcohols and sugars in their body to help them reduce the liability of freezing to a much lower temperature than things that have freezing avoidance, which usually have less sugars, less proteins, and basically can only supercool to a point that's at a lower at a higher low temperature. So these things sort of grade back and forth between each other depending on what species we're talking about. But the things that they can do is that if they have freeze tolerance, they can produce these ice nucleating agents, molecules that will help to cover places where ice can form, and that could form the nucleus of very small ice crystals. They also can produce these alcohols. They have long fancy names here, but glycerol is one type, and there are several others. And then they also produce some types of sugars that help to depress the freezing point so that the fluid can supercool without forming ice. Then they can top those off with antifreeze proteins that depress the supercooling more, and we end up getting sometimes to below 40 degrees Celsius in the body before freezing takes place, if they're freeze tolerant, or something closer to -20, but pretty often a lot warmer than that. Say like -5 to -10 is a common temperature that these winter active insects will end up freezing at. Let's see. I have to keep moving you guys around a little bit because I can't see everything on the screen. There we go. So this is kind of complex here. I haven't had to share many presentations on this situation here, so I should really have pulled stuff down a little bit because Zoom covers up some things. But from a colleague's paper, they've done some work to determine how effective a couple of species of stoneflies are at protecting themselves from freezing. And so these are some stoneflies called Alacapnia. You saw some with short wings. The one male that was guarding the female, that was an Alacapnia, probably granulata. This is the species that they're presenting data for. So the way you try to determine how cold hardy a species is that you try to see how much suppression of or supercooling it can undergo. And so they put these specimens, live individuals, into these tubes and then put a thermocouple in to measure the heat that's actually in the tube. And then they slowly decrease the temperature on them. And in one instance, they're trying to measure this loss of the latent heat of fusion. They can measure a slight change in the temperature that indicates to them that the specimen is just frozen. And so they did a lot of replicates of this and found that they would freeze anywhere from close to -5 degrees C, all the way up to past -20. Some individuals would not show this release of latent heat of fusion until it hit -20 or a little less. And they had a bunch of replicates of them, so that's what these points are with the bars around them, an average and a standard error around them. And so actually for this particular stonefly, males could supercool less than the females could. Females are a little bit bigger bodied and they have maybe some protection from all of the apparatus for producing eggs, and maybe there's less overall water there as opposed to lipid content. But you see, at that point, they can't look in the vial and they can't tell whether that specimen is dead. They didn't give it a chance to revive. They just could sense that there's this release of latent heat of fusion, that they're estimating that this thing died because they could tell that freezing had took place. But they have another means where they put them into containers and reduce the temperature to a certain point. Then they stop that, pull them out, dump them out, see if they recover. And so they did that at a number of temperatures. And when they did that, they could tell that death actually occurred before freezing took place. And this is a thing that is how people talk about cold hardiness. They usually find that the species died before it actually froze. So the rigor of getting down to that temperature is pretty bad. So you noticed here that the males and females didn't have any difference in when they died. The line is the same for both males and females. So just to let you know, the females super cooled to a point where they were estimated to have died at minus 13.2 degrees C, with some variation in that. The males at minus 11, actually, sorry, minus 11 degrees C, and then this lower lethal temperature for males and females are almost identical, and the variation is almost the same. That's a pretty complex graph. But the thing that's important here is it looks like things die before they actually finish freezing. And that seems to point out that males and females are going to die at the same temperature. Here's another one from this same paper that will give you some idea of the risk that they undergo in the wintertime. So these people were studying these stoneflies in Minnesota. It's southeastern Minnesota. It's really pretty cold there in the wintertime. And so they have data from 1958 to 2007. And so this line here predicts, or actually demonstrates, the low temperature, the mean low temperature over this 60-year period. This other line, this dotted one, is the probability that on that particular date the temperature is reached that matches the low lethal temperature for that species. And you can see the probability is high that this species freezes if it's exposed from sometime late November to sometime sort of mid-March. There's another species that they did the same thing with. Anybody have any trouble with the thinking on those graphs? Would any of them survive if the story was that simple?
I mean, probably about 1% or a bit more.
It would make me worry that they wouldn't make it through the next year. So what's happening in this time span is that they're still using lots of behavioral mechanisms to get by freezing. So like crawling underneath the snow, clinging to big objects that retain heat. And not all of them emerge at once. So, you know, there may be some death on a particular 1 or 2 day period where it goes from like a 40-degree temperature, that would be 5 degrees Celsius, down to like minus 20 in a day or two. And that can happen here as well, but it happens more frequently in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So it might wipe out that small window of specimens that emerged at that time or were available at that time. But underneath the water, as long as that water is flowing, it's not going to freeze all the way to the bottom, so they're protected. And maybe 2 days later, it goes back up to 32 or 38 degrees, and they can spend a couple of days feeding and then mate and lay eggs, and everything will be in good shape. So to me, this problem of freezing and the problem of climate change seem to collide a bit. So we've got pretty strong predictions that the temperature is actually going to warm up. It is already warming up in more northern latitudes. So it's quite possible that places that are off limits to, say, some of those stoneflies now because it gets too cold might actually present an opportunity for northward migration as the climate change really takes hold in this century. But the weather is not going to be just even with, you know, fine weather. We know that here because we see warm temperatures, and say the flowers on our fruit trees open up and the bees come out early and are working hard to pollinate them, and then the next week we have temperatures down to the 20s. And so a lot of those bees get caught out, and a lot of the flowers end up dying because they're frozen. So we end up having things emerging at times when it's probably a little early under normal circumstances for them to be out, and they get caught in an ice storm, or they get caught in some polar vortex that spills cold air down into this area, and we have a large number of the existing population out in there. They can be wiped out with not too much trouble. Some other things that might take place in our part of the world and further north is that the pests that are out there, they might end up doing better than they would on average. So we have, say, like more of the white grubs that are in your soil and in your garden, things that produce Japanese beetles, end up being much more successful in a given year. And of course, then they cause damage to your fruit trees or to other agricultural plantings. And there are all kinds of other pests that tend to do poorly in very cold years or normal temperature years, but then really increase in number in the years that are warmer. So climate change should figure into that. Some of the things that I work on are in difficult situations because there's a lot of agriculture that causes them trouble, and climate change is going to be another problem that gets thrown on top. It's already there. Streams are warming up a great deal. And so we could have them migrate further north. When you folks travel around here, you see streams that look really inviting to be in. What do you see most when you travel across the landscape here?
Do you mean like in terms of stream quality, or?
What's the predominant land use as you're traveling down the interstate, say between Springfield and Champaign or Peoria?
Corn?
Corn and beans. Well, it's mostly agricultural.
Yields.
And most of the streams are pretty much straight as an arrow. They've been ditched and have lots of tiles that run into them that drain the fields rapidly. So there are pockets of better habitat. So like the Vermilion River that runs into the Wabash, there's some pretty nice habitat there, but in between there and other habitat to the north that's in good shape, there's this lens of agriculture that may keep them from doing any migration. So I'm a little pessimistic on how the species that I work on will survive into the end of the century because there's no way for them to move north. Do you have any questions about how climate change works or what effects it might have on natural systems? There's a little bit more there, but in the southern parts of the state, it might get warm enough to have some beneficial invertebrates actually decline pretty rapidly. They may already be at their thermal maximum for temperature. Others may think that the temperatures that are coming are just great. Most of those will be probably pests, things that are non-native. So we might see pretty drastic increases in those. Well, that's the 45 minutes. And usually I have lots of questions on this stuff because it's water quality related and natural species and stuff. So if you have questions, feel free to ask.
I had a question. So I know like stoneflies and these types of insects, they're usually good food for like trout and other types of fishes. Has there been any noticeable impact so far on like the animals that feed on these insects because of climate change kind of affecting those populations, or?
Well, if we're talking in relation to trout, there probably are some a little further north, but we don't have native trout. But I already know that there are dramatic changes in the stonefly fauna that's here, and lots of other aquatic insects, because it's a thing that I study. We have a huge research collection where all the specimens that have been published on by people who work at the Natural History Survey are in our research collections. They've all been digitized, and we're able to pull up the information about when they were last seen and how common they were early on in the past century. So I know that lots of species have vanished, and there are some instances where the waters have warmed enough that certain prized game fishes are not as abundant. So like smallmouth bass will be becoming more difficult to find because the waters are getting warmer, and the species of invertebrates that they eat are becoming smaller, and the life cycles are becoming faster because the long-lived large species can't make it anymore in the local streams. I don't know if that exactly answers your question.
Yeah, no, that does.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any questions, or you can ask in the chat, or just unmute.
So I guess I'm kind of curious as to one young person in the Schmidt family, you have something you have to write up for class. How did you get interested in these science presentations? You don't know? Okay. And Kylie, what's your interest?
Kylie? Oh.
Yeah.
I don't know if she can hear. What got you interested in stoneflies? Because you mentioned they're kind of a passion of yours. Was there any particular thing that drew you to studying stoneflies in the first place, or?
Well, I became interested in them because I'm always interested in really great streams and rivers, because fishing was a passion, or still is a passion of mine, and stoneflies are often very colorful, and they're usually only in the best situations. The most high quality streams there are, and so that often means that I travel to mountains, or even traveling. I've collected them in Scotland and China and places in Europe and all over Canada and all over the US here. They're just some of the most sensitive insects, and that means they live in like the best places that are available yet. And I enjoy doing that.
Oh, okay. I think Emma answered your question about her interest in this topic in the chat.
Well, yeah, Emma says that she's interested in entomology. So, oh, darn it. So I've asked Emma whether she's interested in a degree in entomology. The University of Illinois has a really good entomology program. Lots of women faculty too, lots of women grad students. It'll be a great place to do a degree. Maybe she's answering, I'm not sure.
I think, yeah. Oh, yep, I think she answered there.
So, darn it, I'm not used to using this chat.
I think if you just
That's
answer out
what's
loud, I
saying.
think it would be okay. That way you wouldn't have to type.
So I guess, well, Emma's muted. Okay, so if you've got decent grades and are very interested in entomology, I could actually provide you with a link to presentations that occur every Monday in the entomology department. And well, the grades don't depend on that, but you at least see what people do there and see what kind of work people do for entomology. And you could start building a relationship with folks in the entomology department by asking questions, and they would probably be glad to know that somebody from another university is sitting in on their presentations too.
I'm going to leave you now because I already have multiple degrees. I'm too old to go back to
Yeah.
school. But I've enjoyed what I've attended so far, and thank you very much.
Thank you for
Welcome.
coming.
Well, so let's see.
Is the class
So
already?
Emma,
Oh, are you?
you can go ahead and ask. I've provided my email. You can ask for a link to the presentation that occurs on Mondays. I think probably they'll start next Monday or maybe the following Monday. But I can send you the schedule and provide you with the link to get in. And that would be a good start. And in February, there will be Insect Fear Film Festival that the entomology department puts out each year. I don't know what their arrangements are for this year, and it's probably not going to be an in-person thing, but they probably will provide something online. And usually we have a big auditorium filled with people that come, hundreds of people that come to see what spooky insect film or arthropod film they come up with out of the vault somewhere, and usually they bring in somebody associated with the film to come and talk. And then Mae Berenbaum, who's a big wig in entomology and is important in science overall. She has a presentation, and she's the chair of the Department of Entomology. So it would be a great thing to get in on, and I can give you some information about that as well. So just send me an email, and I'll send out what information there is. And there's usually plenty of teaching assistantships. Other people have research assistantship money. So if you're looking to try to get into grad school, there's plenty of opportunities and resources available to you. All right.
Does anyone have any other questions or?
All right. I guess it's time to get back home.